All right. Well, I think we're going to get started and expect a few more people to jump on here, but we want to save all the time we can for questions for Pete. So I want to welcome you this evening to Angus University's Town Hall, Carcass Value and Maximum Profitability. I'm Jessica Hartman. I'll be your moderator this evening. We're excited to be joined by Dr. Pete Anderson, Director of Research at Midwest PMS, as well as Troy Marshall, Director of Commercial Programs for the Association, and Mark McCauley, our CEO, as well, here to this evening. Tonight's going to be a little different than our traditional Angus University offerings if you joined us for our webinars. We hope you've actually watched Pete's presentation prior to joining the meeting this evening. We won't redo the presentation as we've done in the past. Instead, Pete's going to do a brief summary and then we'll jump right into questions and allow that conversation to happen. Don't worry if you didn't watch the presentation ahead of time. You're welcome to stay with us for the meeting, and that presentation is available on our Angus YouTube page for you to watch later. Now, during the meeting, we will ask you all to stay on mute until you are ready to ask a question. And we'll go through our questions. We're going to try and use the hand raising feature, which is located on the bottom of your screen. It may be right on the bar in front. Otherwise, if you double click on that react, there's an option to raise your hand. From there, we'll call on people and you'll have the opportunity to ask a question directly. We do ask that you limit it to one question and a follow-up so that we can allow everybody a chance to pick Pete's brain, and we'll certainly circle back if we have time. We have about 45 minutes for questions, so hopefully great conversation that fills up that entire time. We're excited to get into it, so without further ado, I'll turn things over to Pete to wrap us up and kick us off with a little summary of that presentation. Pete?
Very good. Thanks, Jessica. And I will ask you, Jessica, can you hear me okay?
I can. You sound great.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's go to work then. So what we're going to talk about for just the first few minutes is a couple of the key points from the presentation I gave in the webinar that some of you may have been able to see. We'll talk about carcass value and profitability, and certainly Angus is a breed that has driven growth in carcass value and carcass quality over the last several decades. We really, the cattle feeding part of the business where I work, we try very hard to take advantage of that and work that into to achieve maximum profitability for the cattle that we feed. So I'm going to start with what I call the simplest quiz ever, okay? One of these two creatures you can see is a feeder calf and one is a fed steer. And I took photos that you can't see. There's not a ladder or a yardstick or any other things right beside them, so you can't tell. So the easiest quiz ever is which one is the feeder calf and which one is the fed steer. And that's easy for all of us who've looked at cattle our whole life. We know the difference because we know what they look like. We know that the steer on the left is pretty big and pretty fat, and the steer on the right has just gotten to the feed yard and hasn't been there very long. We spent a lot of time in the webinar, and if you didn't get a chance to hear that, go back and watch, because I talk a lot about how growth occurs and the process of growth, and how something kind of all elbows and shoulders and bony like the one on the right, over time, with 150 or 200 days of feeding, turns into something like the steer on the left, with a lot of fat and a lot of muscle, and ready for market. And the main things that happen during that period of time are some bone growth, a great deal of muscle growth, and then fat deposition at the end of the feeding period that adds to the value of the carcass. And if you understand what happens at the end of the feeding period, you're going to feed cattle longer, because at the end, most of the weight that they're depositing is carcass weight. So if we sell live weight, we would be getting one increase in revenue. But if we're selling carcass weight, because the dressing percent increases during the feeding period, we get even more revenue at the end when we sell carcass weight. And this slide shows how the industry has responded to that, to learning that over the last 20 years. This is data courtesy of my friends at Elanco and their benchmark program, where they summarize millions of head of cattle each year. And you can see the black line is the average hot carcass weight of steers from 2000, the year 2000, which is on the left, through 2022, which is on the right. And I'll update it again next year once we get 2 more years in there. But you can see that line's gone steadily upward. The black line for the steers has a slope of 5.9 pounds per year. And the red line is heifers, and it's gone up almost as much. So we've made cattle a lot bigger over that period of time. And we haven't made them just bigger, we've made them better too. And the particular better measure that I'm using here is percent choice. And, 2.5 decades ago, only about half of the cattle in the industry graded choice, and there were a very high percentage of selects. Now, nearly all of them, depending on which summary you look at, it's 85% or so, will grade choice. A meaningful number of those will achieve premium choice, like certified Angus beef or another premium choice brand. And somewhere between 10 and 14% will be prime, depending on what markets you look at. That increase in quality, along with the increase in size and weight, has given us way more valuable individual animals. And that's the appropriate response. If you think about the cattle business as a manufacturing business, we've got fewer cattle really every decade than the decade before. But what we've done over the last several decades is increase the size and the value of the cattle. And so even though we have fewer units, if you think about it as a production unit in a factory, those units are much more valuable. And so the total revenue has gone up, and the value that we create, the product that we create, has gone up and gotten better. And percent choice is the best example of that. But it's not just the percentage of choice. If you look at this slide, if you were to put carcass pens of cattle in groups from 30 on the left to 90% choice, what you'll see is that as you get to the highest end of that, we get a lot more of certified Angus beef, which is the sort of the gold dots there, and primes, which is the dashes. And we have very, very few of the penalty cattle, the standards or no rolls or the really low value cattle. But it doesn't happen in a straight line. When we go from 70 to 90% choice, the primes and the CABs will double. So getting to 70% choice is really important, but the real value in the cattle business, especially if we're selling on a grid and feeding cattle and selling them on carcass value, is to get from 70 to 90 or 100% choice. And then the premium grades will double. And that's when the ability to earn large grid premiums really, really becomes available to us. The way the feeder cattle are priced these days, that's really all of the profitability that's in cattle when we're cattle feeding, is that upper end of the quality and capturing grid premiums. So those are the things we talked about on the webinar. A great deal more detail about quality grades and yield grades, about the value that each of those creates, about the cost of doing that. One comment I made at the end of that webinar that I think we as an industry have to really address is our ability now to get more quality grade, more marbling without increasing fatness. But we're going to have to select for that. And the Angus breed has genetics to do that. Dr. Esther Tarpoff was kind enough to send me a bunch of data from the association from the genetic analysis that shows that there are a lot of genetics available that are very high for marbling and yet average or even below average for fat thickness. So we can get that marbling with a very low cost of energy and a very low cost of feed, as long as we select specifically for that. So we on the feeding end of the business really like selling high quality cattle, and that's where we make our money. And I'm happy to talk more and more and more about that.
Well, thanks, Pete. I think that's a sentiment that goes from top to bottom in the industry on high quality cattle. Just a reminder for anybody who's joined since we started, we'll take questions by either raising your hand, or if you can't figure out how to raise your hand or for some reason it's not working, you can also message me in the chat and I can call on you that way. And while those are rolling in, Pete, I wanted to start with a question that segues very well with what you were talking about, that selection ability and looking at the marbling versus the external fat. We're thinking about herd rebuilding. We're moving into preparing and looking at that next cycle in the market. And we know that when we have those herd rebuilding moments, we see a big genetic swing, a large gain in genetic progress. Do you think the market is primed, that people are talking about it, thinking about it enough to make marbling one of those spaces where we see a large jump in progress?
I think the best example of that is the drought that we saw in 2011 and 12, where we really lost a lot of cow numbers. But I think the average quality of the cow herd improved pretty dramatically then because those best cattle got moved to places with feed, and then the other cattle were the ones that were harvested then. I think people are looking at it exactly the same way. That they're understanding that averages. It's pretty hard to make a lot of money on averages, whether you've got cows or bulls or feeding cattle. But the outstanding cattle, the higher end premium cattle, are the ones where we have the greatest opportunity to be profitable. And yeah, I think absolutely in culling decisions or herd expansion decisions, there's going to be a great deal of focus on quality.
Absolutely. Um, I am not seeing any hands raised so far. We're starting off a little warming up. Um, Troy, do you have anything to add at this moment while we let people warm up their hands and get those questions primed?
Yeah, one of the things, Dr. Harrison, when you showed the graph about the incremental cost of gain and the improvement relative to carcass weight and the economic incentives just to make these cattle bigger. And I'm getting a lot of questions in the country. Is there a limit? Is there a threshold? At what point do those signals change, or is there anything in this upcoming cycle that will change those dynamics at all?
We used to talk a lot about cattle being too big, and I'm probably the oldest person on this webinar, but it was there for a long time. Carcasses were penalized at 800 pounds or 850 because that was too big, and we heard that they're too big for the box and we can't handle them, and there's a million things wrong with it. But what we found over the last decade or two is that the incremental cost of dismantling a 1,000-pound carcass is almost exactly the same as an 800-pound carcass, and there's a whole lot more product to be sold there. And so for the packers who used to resist quite a bit the biggest carcasses are now actually encouraging them, and we're seeing the conditions in grid pricing change. The heavy limit weight wise is going up. They're allowing heavier carcasses. They're penalizing them less. They're starting to penalize lighter carcasses on the other end. So we're seeing strong signals to make cattle bigger, to make carcasses heavier. We're not seeing much pushback on that. I think it certainly someday there is a limit to that, but I don't know that we found it yet.
Very good.
Jessica, maybe I'll throw in while everyone's warming up here tonight. Pete, what as you think about technology, you talk about managing and carcass composition. Obviously, growth promotants, beta agonists, those kind of things have a huge impact on technology. Talk a little about that today, kind of where we're at today, maybe where, will we measure, will we make improvements in red meat yield through technology in the future? Will that fix some of our fat problems while maintaining carcass quality, or where do you see that playing out in the future?
Musling's highly heritable, Mark, as you and Troy, as you guys know. So if we want to make genetic selection progress for musling, we can do that rapidly. And what we've seen over the last couple of decades is a lot of selection pressure for marbling and a big increase in the genetic trend for marbling, a pretty good strong increase in the genetic trend for musling. But that sort of coincided with an increase in the genetic trend for fatness too. We have opportunity to lower that through genetics. The sorts of technologies that you mentioned, growth promoting implants and beta agonists and feed additives, can really add meaningful amounts of muscle without adding any fat at all. And sometimes they'll actually reduce the percentage of yield grade 4s and 5s. So those are valuable technologies. And one of the great things about the genetic progress we've made for marbling over the last few decades is that we can utilize those technologies and still have a very high grading, high palatability cattle population. But I don't know that the future is going to deliver more progress through those sorts of technologies. I think we've got some excellent ones available to us, but as I forecast the future of that industry, I don't know that we're going to see great progress there. I think the bigger options, the better chance to make progress is going to be on the genetic side, and I think we've got better genetic tools than we ever had. We've got a meaningful amount of genetic diversity, so we can make that selection progress. I think that's where our progress is going to come from. You're absolutely right that the technologies have helped us immensely over the last couple of decades, but we may be nearing a limit toward that, or at least a plateau, and we're going to have to look to other places to find some of our progress. We've been measuring closeout cattle performance for 3 decades. I calculate the rate of biological improvement of about 1.5% a year. Okay, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you compound that, that's basically 10% every 6 years. That gets to be a lot. That's how much better we have to get because that's how much better our competitors are getting. And so, as we work with feed yards and our consultants are in yards, that's the threshold we feel like we have to hit is to get that much better. And pharmaceuticals and other technologies have helped with that. I think it's going to be a little harder to find some of that now. And I see genetic progress as well as maybe health diagnostics as keys to help us make some of that progress for the next decade or two.
Well, we do have a question here coming in from Brent. Brent, I'll invite you to unmute and ask your question.
I couldn't find the little hand, so that's what I did was that
That's
way. But
okay.
Mark kind of touched on it a little bit. But Pete, what's the prevalence of implants and beta agonist use in feed yards? And then is that, I mean, are they just using those? What type of management strategies do feed yards have, especially later in the feeding period to alter quality grade or yield? And, what kind of give us the status of what they do now in what regards?
If a yard is in a program or for natural or NHTC, non-hormone treated cattle, and getting a nice premium, then they'll choose not to use those technologies. But the vast majority of cattle are getting growth implants, and a very high percentage getting a beta agonist feed additive too. And like I said before, we've found strategies to get a great deal of marbling, even using those growth promoting technologies, which gives us the best of both worlds. We can get really efficient production and also make a really high quality product. But we focus a lot in between the timing of when we administer those products, the dosage, the products that we choose, the type of cattle we put them in. There's a lot of emphasis on the strategy that gets us both efficiency and quality. And certainly there are technologies that we choose not to use or use at a low rate because they might hamper quality. But the programs we have now, we've learned over the last few decades how to use those products and get both the efficiency gains that they can give us as well as the quality that the cattle have in them. One of the interesting things, Brent, that we learned over the last couple of decades is that so much of marbling is influenced by the first 30 or 60 days of the feeding period. So even though they may deposit more of that marbling at the end, there are certain cells that can be differentiated into marbling cells or not. And a lot of that decision and programming is dictated early in the feeding period. And so cattle that go through a weather stress or nutritional stress or any of those kind of stresses early in their lifetime or even early in the feeding period, that can impair their marbling somewhat too. So we got to take better care of them their whole lifetimes. And if we do that, then we can get excellent quality at the end of it.
You demonstrated sorting in your presentation and the impact of being able to narrow that bell-shaped curve and improve your mean and push up closer to those that heavyweight threshold. What are some of the, I guess maybe what are some of the barriers to why are we not sorting more than we do today?
So a typical fed cattle population, pen of steers or heifers, is going to have a standard deviation of 102 pounds or so for carcass weight. In other words, 2/3 of the cattle will be within 100 pounds of the average, and then a third, 1/6 on either side, will be further than that from average. So that's a lot of variation, and that's just the way the cattle population is. We can narrow that variation. It's pretty achievable to get the standard deviation down from 100 pounds or so to maybe 40 to 50 with a sort near the end of a feeding period, or maybe 75 or 80 with a sort early in the feeding period. When we do that, then we can get, as Mark suggested, we can increase the average weight without having more heavies because we just get the mean, we get the whole group closer to what that maximum threshold is. There's two reasons we don't, and a lot of people do, but we would do more of it if it was easy to do, but it's not. It's labor intensive. It involves working the cattle at some point that we probably weren't going to work them. It involves generally some pretty sophisticated equipment, maybe some software, and there are really good programs out there. There are companies that have outstanding products and services to do that, but you do have to administer that, and That's a challenge. And the other thing, I think that the grids and the packers have just become a lot more lenient on the upper end, and the economic incentive to avoid those heavies is just not as great as it was a decade ago. We used to really, really, really have to be careful about heavy carcasses. But now the limits are much higher, and generally the penalties are lower. There's still a point where you have too many penalties and you don't want to get there, but it isn't quite as rigorous as it used to be.
Pete, I think one thing that has stood out in my mind from we had some Angus University sessions at convention, and one of them included a producer panel. And Ryan Noble from Colorado mentioned, he really encouraged a lot of our seed stock operators to really dive into and become more knowledgeable on this side of the business. So I'm hoping that that is something that some of the people logged on here tonight are taking advantage of. If you were going to make a hit list of some of the things that seed stock producers could do to continue to enable and support and help the entire chain all the way through, what would that be? Where are those moments that for improvement on the seed stock side?
I would encourage anybody who's in the genetic side of the business to get involved in the feeding side. And there's two reasons to do that. One is you'll understand it better. And I tell cattle feeders the same thing. They should understand the cow side, and we should all transfer a lot more information. One of the frustrations, one of the challenges in the cattle business is that when cattle change ownership, a lot of times there's no information that changes with them. And so we lose identity, and we really don't know what we're feeding sometimes as much as we'd like to. So I'd encourage anybody that's in the seed stock side, the genetic side, to be at least somewhat involved in the feeding side. One, so that we can transfer information back and forth. But two, if you've got outstanding cattle, that's probably the best way to capture the real value that's in them between what they can do performance-wise in a feed yard and what they can do carcass-wise and hang on the rail. So, as far as the hit list, follow your calves, find out where they go, follow your bulls and find out where the calves go, and learn more about them and understand what the considerations on the feeding side are. And I just think there's a great deal of progress to be made there. We have way more of that going on now than we did a few decades ago. We have way more information transfer. We have way greater understanding on the feeding side of what the cow business is, and I think on the other direction also. But there's still room for improvement. There certainly is, and we on the feeding side understand that every different environment supports a different ideal kind of a cow. We know that there are certain things that you just have to live with in the cow side, but there's also things that make more money on the feeding side. If you share in that, I think that then you can understand that better, and I think any feeder would be open to that.
Yeah, certainly create that ideal balance between the environment and the cow and what's going to go down and be profitable in the chain. Scott has unmuted here. I'll invite Scott to ask his question.
Well, hey, Pete, I got a lot out of your presentation. The part that was interesting was the example of birth weight and yearling weight versus, highly correlated traits like fat and marbling, right? And the change that we can make. I guess I'd ask anybody who wants to chime in on this, how do we as seed stock producers get more traction? Is it by Angus Link, or how do we get more communication through to the feeding sector that there truly are bulls that are worth more because of their carcass merit too, and those bulls can be balanced enough to retain daughters, and really in a way I think you can have balanced Angus cattle that'll fit both sides of that equation. Anybody want to throw out things that are working that I might not be aware of?
Yeah, it's great to hear from you. Hope to see you in person one of these days and visit some more. But I think that's a question better answered by all of the other experts on the panel here. So,
Troy, do you want to take this one?
Well, Scott, I really appreciate that. And I do think we have the tools available to make cattle that will work throughout the industry. And the ability to improve the value of genetics keeps getting better. And I think that's really exciting. And I do think Angus Link plays a important role in terms of helping to, I don't want to use the word educate, but has helped to demonstrate the value of genetics, I think, to the cattle feeding side of the business. And as they've seen more of that and see the value, I think it's actually been pretty revealing for most of them to see the value that genetics have, or the impact genetics have had on the profitability of those cattle. And so I think we're making a lot of headway on the feed yard side of that. And conversely, I think the message is getting sent back to the cow-calf guy, the value of those terminal traits. And obviously, they're going to have to continue to make that cow work from her side of things. And so I do think Angus Link plays a pretty big role in that, or has the opportunity to anyway.
And Troy, I think one thing that kind of ties in there is we've been working really hard here in the association to make the seed stock operator almost a go-between between the association and those commercial cow-calf operators and feeders to help be that touch point and help them understand what the program is and then tie that back together so then you as a seed stock operator see more value in your bulls in your operation. Troy, can you talk a little bit about the toolkit that we recently launched for seed stock operators?
Yeah, appreciate that, Jessica. I really do feel like the toolkit's kind of neat because part of the Angus Link program is really designed to be a customer service tool for the seed stock producers to help build the relationships with their cow-calf guys on building the right genetics for on down throughout all the segments of the industry, and also to provide that feedback mechanism where we're getting information back and forth to improve the way we both breed cattle and manage those cattle throughout the system. And the toolkit, there's a new page on the Angus website. If you go to that, you can click on that, and there's just a lot of tools there where it helps the seed stock guy understand how he can utilize the Angus Link program and some of those services to better serve his customers and get them involved on that. And we've all seen the value of these integrated supply chains. And that's the exciting thing for me is Angus Link, I think, kind of can play that role in helping capture and leverage the value of those superior genetics and reward those producers for that. And help that seed stock producer play that role where he may not be in a position to write a check and buy the cattle and feed them out, but he can be involved in that process and be part of that supply chain in that regard. So we're really excited about that customer toolkit and would encourage everybody on the seed stock side to go out to that website and take a look at some of the tools available there. And give us a call. We'd love to talk about how we could use Angus Link to improve your customer service arsenal.
Yeah, and I will certainly be linking to that in our post town hall email that'll come out here in the next day or so. So that'll be a great way to connect there. Lots of great resources that the team has put together. We do have a question in from Andy for Pete. Andy asks, have you seen increased death loss with the higher carcass weights?
I've seen a trend for increased death loss in feed yards over the last 20 years. There's a wide variety of things that are potential causes for that. And certainly as we make cattle bigger and heavier and as we feed them longer, there are more things can go wrong and more time for something to go wrong. So, I think getting them to really high endpoint weights in terms of weight and fatness is one of the contributing factors. I think there's lots of others as well, but we have seen that, yes.
I don't know if you've touched on this at all, Pete, in your work, but the association is part of a study on bovine congestive heart failure and working to collect that data. Is that something that you've had any touch points on?
To a limited extent, yes. And we know that that's a challenge. It's a little hard to diagnose sometimes. We don't always know the cause of death in feed yards. We don't always know what might have happened or what our opportunity was to say. But we know that congestive heart failures, heart disorders are a bigger problem. And we know it's not an Angus problem specifically. It's a cattle problem. But it's a pretty hard one to diagnose sometimes. And it has been a challenge. Whatever opportunity there is to limit genetics that might be involved in that would be great, but I don't know whether that's a solution or not. That's not my area of expertise.
Thanks for chiming in there. And we know that there's a lot of work to be done in that area and looking forward to seeing the results there. Bill, do you have a question?
Sure. Dr. Anderson, enjoyed your discussion on the presentation about the value or extra value created by feeding these cattle longer, which has resulted in some yield grade challenges. Do you see any movement in packers in trying to change the economics of some of those grids to help drive your discussion about reducing external fat along the way?
So, Bill, that's a great question. It's an important question. I can say the last decade, we've actually seen grids move the other way and become a little more lenient with regard to yield grade fours and fives. But part of the reason I think it's so important that we focus on it now is because I don't anticipate that to last. I'm making an assumption. It's a prediction, and I'll clearly label it as such. It's a prediction, but I do think that they'll get more strict on yield grade fours and fives, but we haven't really seen that happen yet. But I just can't imagine that won't happen. And even if they don't, if you think about it from a sustainability standpoint, from an industry standpoint, the calories that are consumed that turn into external fat are just not as valuable. It's just not as good a use of those calories as some other potential use. And one of the things that really struck me when I did a little bit of the analysis for the talk was if we turn a yield grade 3 into a yield grade 4, it takes about 250 pounds of corn to do that. And we may get some marbling along the way. That we may get higher quality, but it'll just be a correlated trait rather than a direct selection for marbling. But if we could get enough marbling to move them from low choice to premium choice, but no more external fat, we could do that for 13 pounds of corn. It takes almost no calories to do that if we can get all of those calories designated specifically toward marbling. And genetics are going to be the key to make that happen. So not yet, Bill, but I think it's coming.
We've got another question tying closely into that from Annie. She said, touching on the marbling genetics, bringing that extra value to the carcass, do you see any movement or emphasis on meat tenderness adding more value?
There's no doubt that tenderness matters, and marbling is more marbling is one of the most predictable ways to get more tenderness. But it's not a direct cause. It's a related trait. And if you go back to the early days of the National Beef Quality Audit, I think 1986 was the first one, and something like 40% of the eating experiences were unsatisfactory according to consumers. We wouldn't have $1.80 fed cattle. We wouldn't have $5,000 bulls in the pasture if people still disliked 40% of the beef that they ate. Right now, that virtually never happens due to palatability, due to tenderness or juiciness or flavor. Sometimes there's a piece of gristle, or maybe some's a little fat, but for the most part, people enjoy eating our product and they're willing to pay a premium for that. I think we need to make sure that we continue that. Tenderness per se is really, really, really hard to select for because it's hard to measure. And just by definition, the only way you can reliably measure it is on a piece of meat. There are indicators in a live animal that are predictors of tenderness, but they're not nearly as good as actually having a carcass and taking a sample from that carcass. But of course, then that animal's been consumed, and we can't use that one. So it's hard to select for tenderness. It's not impossible. We can get most of what we need by getting more marbling, and also by some other management things. Getting the cattle younger, getting them on feed earlier. There's other things we can do that also help over the lifetime of the management to improve tenderness.
I'll call on Brent to come ask his question.
Kind of a follow-up to a couple things there and Mark stole my question again, but on sorting, Pete, when you looked at those bell-shaped curves and scrunching them down, I remember, there was a vet in central Nebraska in the 90s, that had an ultrasound, a feeder calf sorting machine, it was set there right next to the sale barn, and that thing never really took off. And as you mentioned, some sorting coming in, and Troy could probably add to this too. Will we see genomics fit into feeder calf sorting? Because right now we're just kind of categorizing a herd or a group of calves, aren't we? Is there any work on that going forward? Thoughts there in terms of, and obviously there's no demand. I mean, and Pete alluded to this, when we get hopefully out of the cattle cycle where we're at, we're going to start getting bigger discounts for 4s and 5s and maybe heavies. And so when the cattle cycle changes, looking ahead, what would be those tools that might be needed other than genetics, Pete?
It's a real key question, Brent. The more information we have when we sort, the better we can do. And so if all we have are the blunt instruments, right now we value feeder cattle on some really blunt instruments, right? How big are they? What do they weigh? What sex are they? Are they fat or not? What color are they? And what zip code did they get on a truck, right? Well, we can do better than that if we employ some of these sorting technologies with measurements and weight and indicators, physical phenotypic indicators beyond just how much they weigh. That can help. But if we knew more about the genetic capability of the cattle, that would allow us to build better algorithms and better equations and absolutely do a better job of that. Certainly that's true. It's a pretty complex thing to do, but I think we're going to get way better, cheaper diagnostic tests of genetics that are going to allow us economically to know what the genetic capability of either a calf or at least a set of calves is. And that'll help us to make better management decisions. Sorting would be one part of that.
Troy, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I was just going to follow up. I think we're seeing some of the feeders now with the scorecard, using that to determine how they're going to manage that group. But the problem with the scorecard is we describe a pen of feeder cattle. We're not talking about the individuals. And I do think that's where genomics comes into play. If you're making individual selection decisions or individual management decisions, knowing the genetics of specific animals become important there. And that's, I think there's kind of a neat linkage there between like Gene Max Advantage and the Angus Link side. And we're actually working towards integrating those where the Gene Max can help inform the scorecard to make that better over time, as well as I think there is some value in that. The problem with genomics up to this point from a feed yard standpoint and sorting, it's just been a simple ROI type analysis just because of the cost of what those tests are. So, I think the key at a feed yard level is getting those genomics or other tests, but one, be rapid enough that they work chute side or some of those things. And second of all, to get those where the cost benefit ratio is a little bit better. I think it makes a lot of sense, especially on commercial female replacements and those sort of things using genomics at that level though. So.
And Troy, just so everybody knows, can you talk just a brief moment about Gene Max and that program?
Well, and Mark can probably chime in here too. The exciting thing is Gene Max had went through kind of a revamp here. So it's been updated, and we've talked a lot about common currency, and with the Gene Max scores in the past, they were on a different basis than our EPDs. And one of the neat things with this update is you can now get feedlot, grid, beef, maternal scores on equivalents of the indexes. So you can use that when you're making your bull selection decisions and equate that back and forth. I think it's going to be a lot more powerful for producers. And it was great having the information, but it actually is going to help us to make that information more actionable and I think make more dollars off of it. So I'm really excited about some of the changes that they're doing with the Gene Max Advantage program. And I think going into this expansion phase, especially, and Pete and Brent touched on this earlier, with the change in genetics we expect to see as we improve the cow herd. I do think we'll see a lot of cattle replacement females being tested with the Gene Max Advantage as we go into this expansion phase.
Pete, maybe if I just, and I know on this call there's probably a fair number of cow-calf folks, with just my cow-calf hat on, and I hear you talk about reducing back fat, my thought goes to concerns about hard doing cows, right? So how do we balance that piece of I could almost adopt a philosophy of let the fat management be the feedlot's problem, and because we need to keep these enough fleshing ability in our cows, not to put too much selection pressure there, or we might get ourselves in trouble. So maybe more philosophy there, or maybe just kind of some pros and cons as you think about how we as an industry and seed stock producers kind of balance some of those things.
That fits with the comment earlier, Mark, about the cow's got to match their environment, right? And a cow in South Texas is a completely different creature than a cow in Alberta, and we all understand that. And fleshing ability is part of that. But what we see on quality, some of my friends that are in the genetic side of the business tell me that 40% of the increase in quality is due to genetics and 60% is due to just making them bigger and fatter. Okay, so there's not a lot of nobility in just making them fatter. Okay, now there have been economic signals to do that, but that doesn't really change the genetics of the cow. That just means we fed that calf for longer and got to a different endpoint. So can we feed them longer and get to an endpoint that's got a lot of marbling and a little bit less external fat, or just stop adding more to that? I don't know. But we do have to make the cows work. We know that fat and the hormonal production that comes from fat lipolysis, we know that's a big part, that there's just no way to have the sort of reproductive results that we want with really thin cows or hard doing cows. You're 100% right about that. We all understand that. It's going to take a smarter person than me. Our dear friend Harlan Ritchie is the guy who could have been able to answer that maybe. But we have to have all those practical things kept in mind. We got to get the cows pregnant every year. The bulls got to walk. All those things have to happen too. Sometimes in my end of the business, we get really focused on gaining 4.5 pounds and converting below 6 and getting to 99% choice. And those things are great. But we also have to have cows that function. And we understand that for sure.
Mark, can you touch on a little bit of the data we've seen CAB pull together, balancing those maternal and terminal traits and what they've seen there with some of their calling data?
Yeah, it was some question. I think, and again, you show the economics so well there, Pete, about the value of marbling and driving towards that. Of course, I think we hear some questions at times in the field of, that is a carcass trait. If we're going to select for a carcass trait, what's the impact going to be, on the maternal function? And so Esther Tarpoff had pulled some data we went into basically all of our culling data from whole herd reporting and basically seeing why do cows leave the herd, and took all the cows that were culled on for bad feet. We took all the cows that were culled for being, fertility issues, being open, and we looked at their marbling EPD. And what we found was a perfectly normal distribution of marbling EPDs across those cows that went out of the herd on feet or on fertility. So great news, really, right? It meant that those traits weren't correlated, and we could make selection pressure for marbling without negatively impacting those things. So we've I know shared some of that data. It's relatively fresh, but we're going to be sharing it and more data like that, because I think those are really, really great questions that get asked in the country and as breeders, and we need to make sure that we're keeping all those things in mind. But it was very encouraging data, again, showing that we could put selection pressure on marbling without negatively impacting feed or fertility in that case.
And speaking of selecting, Montana wrote in, is there any guidance from the association on what the marbling EPD threshold is to get cattle to grade prime?
Not specifically. We have a best practices. CAB has published a best practices manual that gives a recommendation, and that kind of that minimum threshold has been a 0.65 marbling, I think, is where that's at today. But that's to hit at about 50%, 40 to 50% acceptance rate just for traditional CAB. And there's actually been some discussion about almost a targeting prime kind of designation and digging into the data. They're actually doing some of that right now, digging into the data to kind of see what that in general kind of where that kind of that EPD recommendation or kind of threshold would be, but don't have that data pulled together quite yet.
Thanks, Mark. And looks like Mark Higgins is back up with his hand up. We'll try him again. Mark, you're welcome to ask your question.
Yeah, I think you can hear me now. Um,
Yes.
so has there been any research done with regard to back fat thickness and the correlation between negative back fat and fertility? Mark, I don't know. That's a really important question. It fits with what Mark McCulley and I were talking about a moment ago, but I simply don't know the answer to that.
And off the top of my head, I mean, we could look at some of those genetic correlations. I think it's a good question, Mark. Off the top of my head, or I don't have that data available, but it's one of those we can dig into.
I'll make one last call here. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, we have just a few minutes left.
I can do another one.
Go for it.
All right. So, Angus breeder from Kansas that was a regional manager, has his podcast. Help me, Mark or Jessica.
Matt Perry.
Matt Perry, yes. And so, and I didn't, but Matt was talking about water. And so in Colorado here, and I'm on the border between Colorado and Nebraska. So the Nebraska wells are limited. Ours aren't yet where we're at. Now there are other places in Colorado. Go to Texas, Oklahoma, big situation there, in terms of water. And so Pete, what's your crystal ball in terms of if we get more and more regulated in water consumption or use, and where we go with cereal grains, what we can grow, what we are limited on growing based on water, and then subsequently what that does to feeding cattle?
Brent, that is a question I spend more time thinking about than almost any other. There's no doubt in my mind, thinking about the future of our company or our customers, it's going to move things around. There's no doubt about that. We have areas where we're using water faster than it's being replenished, and what we're growing or what we're using the water for is going to have to change. You're right that there are state by state regulations, and so you may be in one spot and somebody else might be in a similar climate but have different regulations. But we've seen more transload facilities being built in western Kansas to take corn from Illinois or Indiana or somewhere like that and unload it. I think we'll grow less corn out where the cattle are fed. I think a state like Nebraska is in a good position because it's got everything. There are some climate challenges there in terms of weather and so forth for feeding the cattle, but they've got feed, they've got water. I think Southwest Kansas, Texas Panhandle have really got to ask a hard question, and it's the one you asked. And I do think it'll move things around. And one thing that's making it even more complicated is the movement of dairy cows into those areas. And not so much the water that the cattle drink, whether they're feed yard cattle or dairy cows, they do drink some, that matters. But what really matters is the cropping patterns. It's just what you said. Growing corn takes a lot more water than other things. It creates a lot more calories. It creates more solar energy in the form of feed than other crops too. But I think we grow corn in places now that we won't be growing corn a decade from now. I think you're exactly right. And we're seeing already infrastructure being built to move that corn around, which means the industry is of the opinion that the cattle and the packing plants will stay where they are, and the feed production, the crop production may move a little bit. That would be my anticipation.
Jessica, if I could ask maybe one more question, get kind of futuristically, and I know Pete, you talked a little about this, I think, in Feeding Quality Forum. Is there anything new on the biodiesel production? Is there anything coming that might change some of the economics around this? I mean, I think there was a time in our history we made cattle really fat because we needed tallow for explosives after, World War II. But is there anything coming that might change kind of the economics of fat production on cattle?
I think that we'll see the economics. what we're seeing, Mark, what you're alluding to is the integration of food and energy. Okay, and ethanol was the first of those, and we're kind of gotten used to that. And now corn goes to ethanol, and ethanol goes in our gas tanks, and we get distillers grains, and we've adjusted to that. But if you've been around as long as I have, you remember 5 or 10 or 15 years of some upheaval getting to that point, and changing land values in some places, and changing cattle values in some places, and that had a pretty big impact on agriculture. We've absorbed that impact now, but I think what you're alluding to, I think we've got more of that coming. The best way to turn solar energy into something useful is to plant it and have it grow. We are seeing California and surrounding states pay pretty big subsidies for renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel is next. They're going to take a lot of calories that we can grow. I don't think that making tallow on cattle for use like that is going to be the most efficient way to do it. I think what that means is greater competition for corn, which is going to make it more expensive. And this is a prediction, not a fact, but I worry that it's going to make it more expensive to grow livestock, because there'll be additional markets for corn, additional uses of corn or whatever else can be grown out in the fields. That's a thing to really keep our eye on.
Mark Higgins slid in here one more time with his hand raised. We'll get him in here, Mark.
Yes. So for commercial producers that are highly influenced by British and continental breeds, is there a EPD profile that they can target to get them into that higher range of prime and choice and prime?
Yeah, tell Pete if you're looking at me, but I think from an EPD standpoint, Mark, where I thought you were going to go is you were talking about a British continental base of cows, kind of which of those, were you trying to maybe drive more red meat yield? As it relates to quality grade, I think, again, marbling, that best practices recommendation CAB makes a 0.65. I think that's always a good place to start. I think the indexes, are built to encapsulate the premiums that are available or that are around quality grade, and also the discounts around yield grade. So dollar G, dollar B obviously is a feeding and grid. It takes both of those into consideration. So those dollar value indexes are probably the tool, Mark, that I would if a commercial producer is asking to kind of help simplify that selection process. That's really what those indexes are built to do. And again, if they're trying to put a little more emphasis on feeding performance and grid performance, that's really what dollar beef was built to do.
Troy, anything to add there?
No, I think Mark hit it really well. I would throw out that cow base that those bulls are going on makes a significant difference. When we do the genetic merit scorecard, when you look at the Meat Animal Research Center, there's a lot of difference between Hereford and Angus. There's a lot of difference between Red Angus and Angus cattle as well. And then obviously there's a lot of difference within Angus too. And so depending on what cow base those cows are going on, that is going to adjust that EPD profile pretty dramatically. Okay.
All right. Well, I think it's been a wonderful discussion. We've had a lot of great insight. Pete, we just want to thank you so much for taking your time to be here and share your insights with us, as well as Troy and Mark. Thank you for being on the call and joining us in the conversation. And of course, we want to thank all of you. We know you're busy and it's the end of your day, or maybe it's the middle of the evening and we're taking you away from something else. So we appreciate that you choose to spend a few moments with us. We will have a email coming up here in the next couple of days. It'll include a recording of this Q&A in case you want to look back and reference it. Like I said, during the start of the meeting, the presentation by Pete will live on our Angus YouTube page as well for reference. If you have a few moments, there'll also be a survey. We'd love to hear a little bit more about what you thought about the new format and whether this town hall versus our webinar was more informational and had more value for you. And again, I will also link the seed stock toolkit for Angus link as well in that email. But we just want to thank you for spending time with us, and we'll have another Angus University scheduled after the new year. So we hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and we will see you after the new year. Thank you.